getting back to the debt situation, this about 25 billion cedis additional costs that we had to incur in 2020 due to a decline in revenue alongside an increase in expenditures to address the COVID issues led to a huge jump in our debt.
25 billion cedis.
25 billion
is what
cedis.
was spent in 2020.
Yes.
Or you are combining the decline with what was spent together.
You see, basically there was a hole created in the budget for 2020. The hole was created with two legs. One, an increase in expenditure, which meant that, to address the COVID-related expenditures, we needed to find more money. And then also a shortage or a drop in revenue. So already the revenue that we had earmarked to pay salaries and all that stuff was not coming. So now we had to borrow more, not only to fill the gap left by the shortfall in revenues, but also the additional expenditures to address the COVID issues. And that's where that 25 billion number comes from.
What about election spending? The NDC talks about that. Was there an election spending in 2020 that could have added to what we are now crying as the huge national debt?
No, I don't believe that there was any. In fact, it was really a big challenge because you were caught in a situation where you had a pandemic in an election year. And so all the sort of programs that you had planned and budgeted for to provide the infrastructure and capital expenditure to show the people of Ghana that you were, making an impact and doing stuff had to really be curtailed or cut back in order to be able to accommodate this unexpected burden, because we had to prioritize lives and livelihoods. Some people may claim that, okay, fine, providing free water and free electricity is a form of a campaign gimmick. But it was a necessary issue that we had to use to address to protect lives and livelihoods. And so that was something that we couldn't afford not to do, And in fact, when you look at the situation, I personally believe that we handled it exceptionally well, given the fact that it was an election year. There were very few other countries that had to address a pandemic and also an election at the same time. I mean, think about it. You couldn't even really congregate and hold rallies. So even your traditional spending that you would have spent on all these mass rallies, you couldn't do. You had to find other innovative ways to be able to engage with your people. And fortunately for us, because we had established such an exceptional track record in the previous 3 years, that spoke for us, and that track record meant that people had enough data to be able to make a solid judgment call.
What about the spending on the EC, the formal spending that government had to spend on the, not partisan spending, but the spending of the Electoral Commission's bill to run the elections? That added to it, didn't it?
Almost definitely it did. And in fact, we were also supposed to have undertaken a census at the same time. The census is done every 10 years. And we had to defer the census because when we looked at the cost of doing a census and an election and addressing COVID all at the same time, the bills were going to be humongous. So we looked at it and we said, look, we can't defer an election. Can you imagine if we had said, hey, look, we can't afford to do this election?
We did that analysis. That analysis came up, but there was resisted strongly.
Can you imagine?
By advocates of democracy who said we have to have the election.
Of course.
America was having theirs.
Yes, they were. And also, the previous government will expire on the 7th of January. Automatically.
So constitutionally, there was a gap.
Exactly. So there was it wasn't something we could avoid. And spend with regards to the election, I don't recall the exact number, but I don't believe it was any much more than what we had spent in 2016 or 2012. In fact, I think the Electoral Commissioner was very prudent and judicious in her use of the resources that was available to her for the election. And she conducted for me what was an exceptionally peaceful and effective election, reported the results, voting was
people
done
died, so the NDC don't like to hear that election was peaceful. People died in Techiman.
Yes, and that is very unfortunate, and I believe there are ongoing investigations as to why that happened. And I don't believe that was the first time that people have lost their lives in an election, and it's something that we all have to commit to being able to address in the future to ensure that that doesn't happen again.
Yes, but apart from outside Techiman, the election was really peaceful. In fact, this was the election that had a higher number of people voting with very few queues. Because Madam Jean Mensah was able to isolate polling stations across the country in a way that people thought there was low voter turnout. Because the queues were very short. So yeah, you're right.
And also in the midst of a pandemic where you had to also consider social distancing, masks, and so forth and so on. So, you have to give her credit. And it was her first election as well. So I think, on the project management side, she did an exceptional
Last one
job.
on the debt before we come to the 11. So is it this 25 billion that has now sent Ghana into this?
Right. So that 25 billion then pushed our debt to GDP from about 61.5% from about 62.4% in 2019 to 76% in 2020. That is quite a huge jump. Now, if it wasn't for COVID, we would have ended 2020 with a debt of about 61.5, lower than what was in 2019. Because our debt was on a declining path, we had budgeted or projected a positive primary balance. Now, this actually, if you put it in context, is not unusual. I think across the board, according to the World Bank, debt levels increase between 10 to 20% across the board in most countries. And because all these countries were hit with the same issue, they all had to find resources to address this. The only option was debt because your revenues were plummeting because production and productivity had just stalled because people were staying home and not going to work.